The video you are about to see contains content in the form of stories and images that may be emotionally and psychologically challenging, especially for those who have a history of trauma. The stories range from wildfires, flooding, suicide, and online or community violence. These stories are presented by the people who have been impacted by these events, either directly or indirectly. If you need to step out of the room, please notify the facilitator. You may also contact your clinic's behavioral health department. Disasters and trauma are a part of life. The individual, the family, and the community are all impacted. In Indian country, where connection is important, it is difficult to separate the experience of the individual from that of the community. Some losses experienced today are similar to those of the past, such as wildfires, flooding, and disease. However, some losses are unique to modern times. These include suicide, community violence, and even the impact of social media. Although trauma comes in many forms, the stress response is similar. When the individual is faced with a threat, the brain releases hormones resulting in a flight, fight, or freeze response. If an individual stays stuck in this response for long periods of time, it can affect their physical and psychological well-being. Anxiety, anger, and depression are common after a traumatic experience, and people need support from a healing network, including family, friends, and providers. Native people were familiar with how loss and grief impacts the person and the family. They employed healers and healing practices such as medicinal plants, songs, dances, and ceremony that helped move the individual through these times. What you will hear now are personal accounts of loss. The events are different, but you will see the psychological responses are similar. Moreover, when a community or tribe responds with support, it can shield the individual from long-term damage. Gail Zapata, a wellness facilitator and a member of the Little River Band of Pomo Indians, speaks about the loss of her home during the Redwood Valley Complex fire, one of the major fires that devastated California in 2017.
You know, it's interesting because my oldest sister always says, you know, when you have problems, she says you're like a reed, or, you know, you just kind of like go with it. And I can't help but get emotional to talk about it because, you know, losing my home was a very devastating thing. My grandma always used to say, you know, we grew up in very meager surroundings. We didn't have inside plumbing. You know, she didn't have central heating or any of that. We had a wood stove, and she cooked on a wood stove. And it wasn't until I was a teenager that we got inside plumbing. And one of her dreams was always to have a home. Redwood Valley, you know, developed a new community on Rodi, and there were 27 homes that were built there, and mine was one of them. And so there was a sense of pride in having my own home. I paid for it. I owned it at the time of the fire, and it's where my kids, you know, from the age of 10, I think, or 12, and 14, you know, they grew up there. And so when the fires happened, I found, at first I think I was in shock, you know, and I was just kind of like, yeah, it happened. You know, as it began to set in that, yeah, your home is gone, everything you own is gone, and I began to think of not big things like TVs, but it was the little things like my kids' Christmas ornaments that I've had since they were in kindergarten. So it's the little things like that. My prayer book that has my grandma's handwriting in it. You know, my son's cradle board, basket that my grandma gave me. It was those kinds of things that are really irreplaceable. And I am a very positive person, And I feel like I have a lot of coping skills. I have, healthy coping skills, And it was really my good friend who said to me, "You're experiencing a trauma." And as much as I know, I'm a mental health first aid instructor. And as much as I know about that, it wasn't until she said that it was like, oh my gosh, there was like a sense of relief and a release that, yes, Gail, you had been through a trauma. Losing your home was a traumatic event. Losing everything that you owned and valued was a traumatic event. And once I was able to recognize that, then it was like, oh, it's okay to feel what I'm feeling. It's okay.
Gail reminds us that even individuals with healthy coping skills and knowledge of trauma will still experience a natural response to trauma and disaster. In February 2017, the Oroville Dam's emergency spillways were significantly damaged. The dam is capable of storing more than 3.5 million acre-feet of water. This meant that 180,000 people living downstream were in danger should the dam fail. Joyce Gonzalez, a substance abuse counselor, was one of the individuals who was ordered to evacuate.
It was really devastating. There were police, there was law enforcement, which was sheriff and local Oroville PD and CHP were here going up and down our streets down here with megaphones, and the fire department was too, telling us to get out. You need to get out now. It's an evacuation. It's mandatory. Felt like it was a war going on, like you would see in a movie when they're telling you to leave. So yeah, there was definitely an emotional impact for me too, and I think it's easier, and it's probably easy for most people, to see other people's hurt than to get to your own. But I definitely think the rash I broke out was my own hurt, and I was just trying to hold it down. It was hard to be at work. It was hard to just to kind of focus, because I didn't know.
Displacement and uncertainty can trigger an emotional and physical response. Suicide is another crisis that has devastating effects on families. There are many unanswered questions that remain after a completion. The grief and sense of guilt felt by survivors can be debilitating. Megan Ray, Pomo in Wailaki, speaks about how the loss of her brother impacted her life.
I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't even go to work, go to school, all of these different things that had been so normal to me. It almost seemed like I couldn't do that anymore, or I was being disrespectful to my brother, that I had continued to go on with life. Every laugh was a spit in his face, that I could laugh.
Even the internet has its threats, be it from cyberbullying or watching violence on social media. Native people from around California and across the nation watched the protests on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota in 2016. The protests against an oil pipeline being built caused concern regarding the impact on the land and the water. Many were inspired to support the water protectors and viewed it as a tribal sovereignty and civil rights issue. Individuals watched on social media and were triggered by the brutality they witnessed against the protectors. Kyle Bill, a member of the Quetzaldehe Wintun Nation and a tribal leader, speaks about how watching the violence on Facebook brought up an emotional reaction.
Social media, and Facebook in particular, was an outlet for us to be able to see in real time what was happening. And so we had that connectedness, which was, seeing some of the violence and some of the brutality on Facebook. It almost made you feel like it was happening to you. And so it's really surreal to see that. see that kind of behavior and those actions happening today is very traumatizing, to know that it can still happen. We can still be abused by police officers and law enforcement. And it was really scary. It made you feel like, what's stopping that from happening to me? And that's trauma that's happening, and experiencing it. And on both sides, the police officers and law enforcement and the Native people that are there and the non-Natives are all experiencing trauma there. And the effects of Standing Rock and what happened there are going to be things that we'll see 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and maybe even generations, the trauma that happened there. And social media in its goodness in connecting us, I think, is also going to play into the role of trauma being experienced through.
As you have heard, trauma comes in many forms, and though many clinics and tribes have emergency plans, not all do. Those plans often do not comprehensively address mental health needs following a disaster. Nikki Mulholland, a tribal administrator at Cedarville Rancheria in Modoc County and a board member for Strong Family Health Center, gives her account of a shooting that devastated the tribe.
In February 20th, 2014, during our first official tribal court hearing, there was a mass shooting in this room. And we lost 3 tribal members and our tribal administrator at the time. We had 2 other tribal members that were shot with serious injury. And that day we lost 20% of our tribe. With myself, with suppressing what I was actually going through, and at the time I was 4 months pregnant with my son, it was just going and going and going so I wouldn't have to think about what I was going through. For one thing, it felt selfish. Rather than dealing with the feelings that I had with that, I just threw myself into my work, and in doing so, had a hard time dealing with the feelings when they did come out. And when you have PTSD, and at the time, I knew of PTSD, but I wasn't diagnosed and have been diagnosed since, also with anxiety and depression. But there are certain triggers, and you just cannot see them happening. Sometimes you never know what's going to happen, and you're just going to fall apart. And sometimes you feel like you are weak if you allow yourself to fall apart.
You have just heard 5 stories about the short and long-term impact of disasters in California's Native communities. None of the speakers experienced the trauma in isolation. The trauma impacted their children, elders, and the rest of their community. Trauma can tear a community apart, or it can bring them together to address recovery and healing. Tribal leaders and clinic administrators can take the lead in the effort to addressing the psychological needs following a disaster. Steps leaders can start with are increasing their awareness and knowledge regarding what heals individuals and communities from trauma. They can create plans, policies, and procedures that put psychological well-being as a priority. They can make sure there is a safety net of long-term support following a disaster. They can make sure cultural resilience is woven into the response. 2 of our storytellers share how these factors were important to healing following a trauma.
It was even more important to have people around me to support me. And, my tribe did that in a number of different ways in terms of trying to provide resources. My friend did it, setting up a page so people could donate, to buy clothing. So all of those things just, again, really helped me through it. And then beyond that, to see the tribes come together, to see Upper Lake Rancheria, Middletown Middletown Rancheria, Coyote Valley, Sherwood Valley, Grayton Rancheria, the Grayton tribe, even Yocho Dehi, over reach out to our tribe, reach out to my son, reach out in the community, not just to help me, but to help the other families that had lost their home on Redwood Valley. There were 6 homes that were lost. But the fact that people, really, cared was really what helped me through it too, because I felt like I'm not alone. I know there are these 5 other families or 4 other families that had lost their home too, so I'm not alone. And so to be able to see them and, give them a hug and let them know that, yeah, I'm feeling that way too, and it's okay, because it is this thing called trauma, and it's hard, but we're going to get through it, and take care of yourself. To give those kinds of words to each other was very important.
We had a couple healing sessions put on by the Native Wellness Institute. They were able to come and do some healing circles with us, and we opened that up to the community, and not just the Native community, the community at large. They wanted to participate, and we had that at Strong Family Health Center. We did some cleansing ceremonies. We smudged. We had prayer. We sang some songs in here, and it had a very powerful impact on not only the individuals that were here from the tribe, but also some of the other individuals that were participating. We had sort of reached out to other Northern Paiute bands to try to reclaim our language, some of our cultural practices, and we are actually now in the process of having some elders from Pyramid Lake area be able to come and teach our young generation more about their ancient ways.
So, who should be a part of this community network? Tribal leaders, behavioral health staff, wellness programs, elders and parents, youth, schools, and spiritual leaders. Once you identify these natural helpers, how can you engage and empower them? Some of the principles that foster healing include establishing safety, listening to their story, connecting or reconnecting to a social and resource network, empowering people to be a part of the healing movement in their community. What is your tribe or community doing?